So for all 10 of you out there who don't know, Game of Thrones has finally come to an end after 8 years of circulation. The fans have endured the scheming, the heartbreaking, the downright infuriating, now it's all over. And let's just say that people are definitely not happy. To be fair, not everybody feels that way. There are some people out there who feel like the final season was a satisfying conclusion to one of the greatest TV shows ever made. But just speaking for myself, I am not one of them. Sadly, it appears that Game of Thrones has fallen into the same trap as shows like Dexter, How I Met Your Mother, Lost, True Blood, The Sopranos, just to name a few, by giving us one of the biggest letdowns in television history. That's not to say that there's nothing good in the final season, nor is it to say that the show hasn't had great writing, great acting, and great directing and great production value throughout its 8-season long run. I don't hate everything about the last season, nor did I dislike what the showrunners were trying to do, but it certainly seems, to me anyway, to be a Last Jedi style situation, where the concepts and the ideas of where to take the show were good, but the actual execution is what tripped everything up. And the older that I get and the more films and shows that I watch, the more I realize just how damaging a bad execution can be on a piece of media. While we all still loved watching the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones, would we really have enjoyed it as much if we knew that this was where it was all heading? But anyway, there's a lot to go through on the final season, as well as the whole show in general, and while I know I'm not going to be able to cover everything, let's just go ahead and try to dissect the core problems on the lead up to the final season and why ultimately the show failed to deliver a satisfying resolution. Also, spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about Game of Thrones like you have seen the whole show, so fair warning. So let's go back in time a little bit. Back in 2006, David Benioff had a phone conversation with George R.R. Martin's agent about books of his that Benioff could possibly adapt. The agent sent Benioff copies of the Song of Fire and Ice series, and he became so enthralled with the first book that he finished it in roughly 36 hours. Meeting with his friend D.B. Weiss, who shared his enthusiasm for the book series, Benioff conducted a 5-hour meeting with Martin, who himself was previously a screenwriter, about possibly adapting the books into a TV show. According to Benioff, they were able to convince Martin of the idea by correctly predicting the identity of Jon Snow's mother. Martin approved of Weiss and Benioff's proposal to make it into a HBO series, as only HBO would allow the kind of graphic material that was present in the novels. Development officially began in 2007, with Weiss and Benioff as executive producers and Martin acting as co-executive. Each of the books would take up roughly one season, with Martin writing one episode each, and Weiss and Benioff essentially handling the rest. After a rocky start with a pilot episode in 2010, the show quickly smoothed out and became one of the most viewed and critically successful TV shows of all time. Everything was going hunky-dory, and then season 5 came along, and that's when things started to get a bit more complicated. For the first 4 seasons, Weiss and Benioff had their groove. There was a veritable treasure trove of material for them to play around with, and they certainly knew how to bring Martin's words to the screen in a compelling way. But as time went on, the less and less they had at their fingertips, which meant that the reins of the show started to fall more and more into their hands and their hands only. Now, it would be fallacious to say that the eventual decline of the show's quality was entirely on Weiss and Benioff's shoulders. Really, this outcome was kind of inevitable. I mean, the show was being produced faster than George R.R. Martin could write the new books, which meant that the showrunners had no choice but to go it alone and just try their best. That being said, just taking a look at the general quality, it's clear that season 5 was where the switch finally flipped. Characters ended up getting regressed, changed, or cut out entirely, plot lines were condensed and dumbed down, the pacing began to fluctuate more than previous seasons, but at the same time there was still a fair amount of material that was taken from the books, such as The Faith Militant and Cersei's Walk of Atonement, and some of Weiss and Benioff's additions actually helped move the story along. Then season 6 came along, which simultaneously made things both better and worse for the show. The writers ended up running into the same problem as the previous seasons, with even less of Martin's material to draw short on, and the few things that they did bring in from the books, let's just say it wasn't handled in the smoothest of ways. Euron Greyjoy goes from this cunning master manipulator obsessed with the occult and black magic to this basic medieval jock slash thug stereotype that we've seen quite a few times already in this show. But again, a lot of the newer additions weren't unwelcome. Seeing Ramsay Bolton accumulate power in the north was a great idea, and the season finale with Cersei destroying the Sept of Baelor and Daenerys setting sail for Westeros is one of the show's highlights in my opinion. So while there were still concerns floating about the air, the season 6 finale gave hope to the notion that the showrunners knew what they were doing, even though they had all but exhausted Martin's books by that point. Then we came to season 7, which opened surprisingly strong. The pacing is good, the characters and their motivations are back on track, the war between Daenerys and Cersei is ramping up, the White Walkers... oh... yeah, the White Walker episode, I forgot about that. Okay, so this episode was the first major nail in the coffin for a lot of the Game of Thrones fanbase. I myself wasn't so eager to jump on the hate train quite yet. The episode still had things that I liked in it, but at the same time, looking back on it, there's no way to deny that Beyond the Wall, as the episode was titled, signaled the downfall of Game of Thrones. The leaps and gaps in logic, the poor pacing, the blatant disregard for the established rules of the universe, the butchering of characters' personalities, all of these things we would see repeated in the next season and a half, and this was the first episode that it became fairly obvious. Then came the 8th and final season. Why was this the final season, you ask? Well, if I'm honest, I'm kinda wondering that too. According to all the facts that I could find, the decision to make Game of Thrones 8 seasons long was made by Weiss and Benioff. George R.R. Martin said in an interview on the red carpet that the amount of material he has could take the show well into 12 seasons, but for whatever reason, the head writers on the show decided 8 seasons were enough, apparently. There has been a lot of tinfoil hat speculation as to why this decision was made, and we may never know the full story. It's more than possible that HBO might have stepped in and influenced the final decision in some way, or the writers simply grew bored of the whole project and wanted to move on to other things. Any of these are valid possibilities, but again, we will probably never know the truth. What we can be certain of, though, is that the choice to limit Game of Thrones to 8 seasons was one of the crucial mistakes the showrunners and or HBO made, and whether or not it was Weiss and Benioff's decision or HBO's decision doesn't really matter. This decision was still the thing that ended up sinking Game of Thrones into the muck. If you watch the final season, it's clear that the plot feels a great deal more rushed than previous seasons, partially because there were just fewer episodes, but mainly because the writers were eager to tie everything up as quickly as they could. But that kind of mentality is the main thing which led to the final season being so disappointing for a lot of people. When it comes to the conclusion of any great story, the first thought in a creator's mind should be how to make it as strong and sensical as possible, not let's just get this over with and be done with it. Again, I'm not going to try and make a definitive statement as to whether it was Weiss and Benioff or HBO or all of the above that fell into this mindset, nor am I going to say that they didn't try, because you can see the seeds of what they were attempting to do embedded within the script. But if you really did care about writing a satisfying ending, they would have allowed more seasons and more episodes to air before they wrap the whole thing up. Hell, they could have just passed the project on to another set of talented writers who were just as passionate about Game of Thrones as they were when they started out. But as a result of time fatigue and more than likely a desire to move on to other things, the showrunners ended up screwing the pooch on one of their most lucrative projects. HBO or the lead writers, it doesn't matter whose fault it was that this happened, the only important information that we need to know is that it did, and as a result, a show that should have had an emotional and impactful conclusion ended up fizzling out into the same mediocrity as a million other shows that came before it. But that's enough of the history and the logistics of this thing. Let's just go over where the final season really went wrong. One of Game of Thrones' biggest strengths has always been its dedication to realism. In many ways, the series acts as a subversion of various fantasy tropes in an attempt to bridge the imagination of fantasy and the grim harshness of reality. The handsome blonde knight isn't heroic, he's an incestuous murderous crippler of children. The honorable good guys are not rewarded for their morality with a happy ending, they are manipulated, tricked, and brutally murdered. In both the books and the early seasons of the show, Game of Thrones feels like a piece of well-written medieval history. The oppression and violence against commoners and the shallow, self-absorbed politics of the rulers feels very true to how life would have been back then, just with the addition of dragons and White Walkers. That realism is one of the main things that made the show so engaging. We feel the sense of dread and danger for the characters simply because of the environment they live in. But as the show went on, it started to lose sight of that realism, and as such, one of its greatest strengths began to disappear. Previously established rules, character traits, and thematic tones that the show spent years building up started to get abandoned and left by the wayside. Instead of adhering to the internal logic of the world, the show continually stretched the audience's suspension of disbelief until it snapped completely. Now don't get me wrong, some suspension of disbelief is fine, I mean this is still a fantasy after all, but the one cardinal sin the show ended up committing, which no fantasy fiction should, is that it broke the rules of its own universe, and I mean that in both a physical and thematic sense. The physical world of Westeros had realistic rules and limits which were very similar to the kind of rules that you would get in a medieval setting with medieval technology. In the later seasons, a lot of these rules ended up just getting contradicted or outright ignored. Seasons 1 through 5, it took weeks and weeks to travel the length of Westeros. In season 7, it takes a raven and Daenerys on a dragon about 2 days. Robb takes a couple of arrows and a knife to the chest and he dies. Arya gets stabbed multiple times and she lives long enough to get a little TLC from Lady Crane. Euron demands the construction of a fleet of 1,000 ships from people who live on a bunch of islands that are what again?
Rocks and bird shit.
And the whole fleet is completed in about 1 season, and not only that, but they are also super advanced megaships that can bulldoze any rival fleet that gets in their way, and can apparently teleport from location to location as well. I know it seems like nitpicking, but small details like that cause the viewer to question the integrity of the world of Westeros, and they become more and more frequent as the show went on. Then there's the thematic kind of realism that the show also ended up abandoning. The themes of Game of Thrones have always been along the lines of good people are not rewarded for their goodness, bad people win the day through scheming and backstabbing, wars turn men into monsters, history is written by the victors, the realities of heroes and villains must always be questioned, etc, etc. The themes are as concrete and hard-hitting as the physical laws of Westeros. This is a harsh, cruel, bloody world where goodness does not guarantee happiness, and power-hungry maniacs are allowed to come out on top over and over again. In short, even though it occupies a fantastical setting, the series has always been about the realities of warfare, of power, of politics. These are just some of the major themes the show touches on, and like the physical realism of the show, they ended up getting completely forgotten about by the final season. Nope, it turns out that the day is saved, the good guys win, everybody's happy, and no one that we like ends up having to die. It's all okay in the end, the bad guys are vanquished, the heroes are victorious, and there are barely any consequences for any of it. Oh, a whole town of people are mass slaughtered by a randomly crazy woman on a dragon? It's fine, we won't even mention it after the nasty crazy woman is killed. Oh, the evil Lich King is coming to kill everyone and convert them into his army of the dead? One quick stab to the gut and everything's fine. This is what I mean when I say that the thematic realism of the show began to suffer as the series went on. Instead of characters enduring terrible consequences simply for adhering to their morality, or having to survive terrible hardships and sacrifices just to attain victory, the show ends up wrapping everything in a nice convenient bow without any proper adversity, complication, or consequence. The finale literally has all of our favourite characters alive, unharmed, and on top of the world, while the villains, or the characters who randomly became villains in the span of 1 episode, died and are no longer threats to the realm. Yeah, Jon Snow has to go out beyond the wall, but given how he said he didn't want to be king and he kind of enjoyed being out beyond the wall with the wildlings anyway, I don't really see that as much of a consequence or a punishment for what he did. And while I know there is an argument to be made for giving our characters a reprieve after all of the hardships that they've endured up to the end, that still doesn't change the fact that that kind of mentality doesn't mesh with the themes and the tones that the show was was originally building up. Realistically, not all of our favourite characters would have survived the Battle of Winterfell. In fact, most of them would have been killed, but all of them make it out without a scratch except for the Mormonts. If this battle took place in seasons 1 through 4, at least half the characters would have died by the end. Brienne would be dead, Jaime would be dead, Arya would be dead, Sansa and Tyrion would definitely be dead. By having characters miraculously survive ordeals which should have easily killed them in the earlier seasons, the show undermines its sense of realism and therefore prevents the audience from buying into the world that it's trying to build. I mean, this is a show where stuff like this happened, but it's also a show where characters can survive stuff like this. This lack of realism even applies to some of the bloodier aspects of the show. To give an example of what I'm talking about, just compare the infamous Red Wedding with the massacre of King's Landing. The Red Wedding cemented itself as one of the most brutal and heartbreaking moments in the show's history, and there are several reasons for that. One, it comes out of nowhere, but it still makes sense within the context of the story. Two, we're seeing a ton of characters we've grown attached to getting betrayed and slaughtered by their own allies. Three, the War of Five Kings is pretty much won in a single swoop by the bad guys. Four, all hope of our characters winning the fight against the Lannisters is pretty much gone. And five, all of the blood and gore. The main reason that the Red Wedding was so affecting was just how real it felt. You felt the gravity of the deaths, you felt the tragedy, you felt the backstabbing betrayal of the whole thing. There was a real build-up to this massacre, yet we still didn't see it coming. And there were also huge consequences to the violence. Compare this with the massacre at King's Landing, which was given no setup, no build-up, doesn't even make any sense within the context of the story or the characters, and doesn't have any long-lasting consequences. I mean, really think about it. The massacre happens, King's Landing is burnt to a crisp, Jon kills Daenerys, is imprisoned, and then the massacre is never mentioned again for the rest of the final episode, as if it never even happened. This has got to be one of the bloodiest moments in the show's history. More people die in this 10 to 20 minute stint than any other episode, but we, the audience, didn't feel the impact of it because it didn't feel the least bit realistic. And I'm not meaning realistic in the sense of, oh, a dragon is coming down and burning the city away and that's not realistic in the least. I'm meaning realistic in the sense that this was not a well thought out and cunning strategy for characters to gain an advantage in their war at the cost of other people's lives. That's what the Red Wedding was, and it was one of the reasons that that moment was so impactful. Our good guys were beaten by the duplicity and cunning of their enemies. That is realistic. One woman who has repeatedly positioned herself as a champion of the people randomly going crazy and genocidal on civilians out of nowhere when she doesn't even need to because a friend of hers was killed, that is not realistic. Do you see what I mean? Realism was one of the major building blocks of the series, a metaphorical pillar holding the plot, world, and characters up for us all to enjoy and appreciate. But by the end, the writers had completely forgotten about it, and by doing that, they essentially knocked down one of the show's most crucial foundations, which brought the rest of the structure down with it. If a show is going to spend its first few seasons setting up a gritty and realistic world where actions have consequences, things like landscape and geography have an effect on the plot, and any character can die at any time simply for crossing the wrong people, then it has to stick to that. It can't just forget about its realism halfway through just for the sake of making it more convenient. Fantasy fiction needs to hold itself to the laws of its world building, otherwise it's dooming itself to failure, because if a fantasy series can't follow the rules of its world, then what reason do we have to get sucked into it?